Something I've been asked about a few times is whether it's true that there are underground tunnels that cut through plague pits. It's an interesting question, and one that, to be quite honest with you, I didn't know the answer to. I'd heard rumours. One said it was the Piccadilly line. Another said it was the Victoria line. Some of them incorporated gruesome details like unwitting construction workers being showered with bits of corpses or even encountering ghosts. Several of them were mentioned by respected authors, so let's investigate. In the 14th century, Europe and Asia experienced a pandemic that would eventually become known as Bubonic Plague, or colloquially, the Black Death. It was caused by the Yersinia pestis bacterium and spread by flea bites. Symptoms included fever, vomiting, nausea, and joint pain, but the most obvious tokens were huge, hard swellings known as buboes in the armpit, groin, or neck. The end result, in the vast majority of cases, was death within a week. Originating in Asia, the disease spread along trade routes, arriving in London in autumn 1348. The disease couldn't have asked for a better breeding ground than the crowded, filthy city. With an 80% mortality rate and the people having no real understanding of how it spread, the plague wreaked terrible destruction on London. Some estimates place the death toll as high as 60 or even 80%, although records of the era make it difficult to be precise. So rapid was the pestilence that digging individual graves was no longer practical, and so developed the plague pits, mass graves where bodies would be dumped with little ceremony. The possibility of being buried without the usual religious offices must have been almost as frightening to the God-fearing people of the medieval world as the plague itself. Fortunately, though it couldn't have seemed so at the time, the plague killed so quickly that it effectively burnt itself out, but it would return several more times, inspiring terror whenever it did so. The last major outbreak in London was in 1665. Plague pits were initially dug in church grounds, but these were soon overwhelmed. New pits were dug on what were then the edges of the city, accepting the dead from several parishes. Often the exact locations of these pits are unknown. What we do know is that they were large. For instance, several streets in Soho lie on top of one, including Carnaby Street. So what's clear is that the idea of an underground tunnel encountering a plague pit by accident is certainly not implausible. But did it ever happen? It was time to do some digging. Metaphorically speaking, I mean. First of all, Aldgate. There is evidence that there was a very substantial pit from the 1665 outbreak here, as mentioned by Daniel Defoe in his Journal of the Plague Year. Defoe describes it as 40 feet wide, 15 feet long and 20 feet deep, supposedly attached to St. Botolph's Church. According to more recent legend, the station was actually built within the pit itself, so it's strange that nobody mentions it in any official records. Then there's Green Park. This is a specific location I've heard mentioned, with either the Jubilee or Victoria line encountering a pit. One story states that they incurred the wrath of an unquiet spirit, a giant with outstretched arms dubbed the Queer Man. It is true that Green Park was used as a burial ground before it was a park, but for lepers rather than plague victims. But there's no contemporary record of construction workers encountering them either. What about Knightsbridge? It's said that the Piccadilly line takes a detour to avoid a pit here, but again there's no evidence of such a pit. If I might advance a personal theory, this may have been influenced by the TV serial Quatermass and the Pit, in which construction workers in the Kensington area uncover ancient alien remains. The film adaptation goes further, having the construction work in question be on an underground line. There may be sort of a pit here, although it's not technically on the underground. This is the London Road depot of the Bakerloo line, and rumour has it that one of the sidings stops just short of a pit. The siding is apparently intended to stop runaway trains, and if the legend is true, I would imagine that in the event of an accident it would be mighty difficult to figure out exactly how many bodies were in the wreckage. Sick jokes aside, there is again a shortage of corroborative evidence here. One point I would reiterate is that plague victims were often buried in existing burial grounds. The underground encountered those quite frequently. The District Railway seems to have run into them fairly routinely, encountering them near Westminster Abbey and Cannon Street. Bodies thus encountered were often sent out to Brookwood Necropolis for reinterment, ironically by train from the Brookwood Necropolis railway station in Waterloo. This is a fascinating station in itself, but alas too fascinating to go into detail on this already longer than usual video. The Jubilee Line extension, running through Southwark, more recently passed beneath the Crossbones graveyard, necessitating an archaeological survey. I'm planning a fuller video on this in the future, but I just thought I'd mention it now while I'm here. Well, so far this has been a bit disappointing, hasn't it? Not one confirmed plague pit. Oh, but there's an interesting twist in the tale, and it links back to Aldgate. You see, the first version I'd heard of that tale said that the station built in a plague pit was at Barbican, and it was while looking into this that I unearthed a real bona fide, honest-to-God story of an underground railway tunnel in London encountering a plague pit. 2, in fact. The tunnel in question is Crossrail, or the Elizabeth Line if we're being official about it. Now I should say here that these days encountering a burial ground is rarely accidental. When a railway is planned, potential obstacles are mapped out as far as possible. Therefore, it was expected that when Crossrail got to Liverpool Street, it would run into the old burial ground attached to Bedlam Hospital. What they actually found, though, was a mass grave of 30 people. At the head of the grave was a headstone marked 1665. The obvious conclusion was that this was indeed the final resting place of victims of the Great Plague. DNA testing confirmed this to be the case. It was also no surprise when they encountered an earlier medieval pit at Charterhouse Square. This one dated back to the Black Death. Local lore said there were as many as 50,000 people buried here. More sensible estimates said it was more like 5,000, but that's still more skeletons than you usually want to run into. But for the Museum of London's archaeologists, this was a golden opportunity. You see, I said near the beginning of this video that the bacterium that caused the Black Death was Yersinia pestis, but until recently we didn't know that. Not for certain. The evidence pointed very heavily towards bubonic plague, but some historians had their doubts. Now, the opportunity was there to find out for sure. Remains were again sent for genetic testing, and the results came back positive for Yersinia pestis, finally confirming the theory once and for all. So in conclusion, no, there is no evidence that the London Underground definitely encountered plague pits. But Crossrail certainly did. Good evening. I hope you enjoyed this pestilential tale from the tube. If so, perhaps sir or madam would consider hitting the like button, mayhap subscribing and sharing with friends. Have you heard any tales of gruesome discoveries on the underground, plague pits, leper graves, or anything else? Let me know in the comments section. I always like a disgusting story. And I'll see you again soon for another tale from the tube.